I'm joined by Assistant Professor of Economics at George Washington University, Stephen Hamilton. Thanks so much for your time. We're seeing these various roundtables happening across the country, government ministers leading them in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, right across the nation. What's the core question that needs to be answered by the summit in your view?
Yeah, g'day, Kieran. I think, look, there's no doubt that the job market over a really long period of time isn't really working the way we'd like it to, right? So we've got a bit of a weird situation where, we currently have the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We've got finally wages starting to grow again, but all of that's happening in this sort of temporary inflationary period. And I think the focus of the Job Summit needs to be on the longer term trends that existed before the pandemic and, frankly, will return after the pandemic if we don't have some major policy change. And so, I wouldn't be too optimistic about exactly what the summit can deliver, but at least I think that should be its focus.
The OECD recently had analysis that had Australia down at the bottom. I think it was second last of developed countries when it comes to this issue of skills and labour shortages. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think, one issue that's clear is sort of our migration system, even pre-pandemic, really isn't correctly sort of set up to meet the kind of needs that businesses need. The thing I would be very concerned about is sort of using the pandemic and the restrictions that it's put on immigration to make that kind of thing permanent, right? I think what we need to do is kind of go in the opposite direction. Ideally, in the short run, have a bit of catch up to make up for the hundreds of thousands of missing migrants that we have. But going forward, really increase that rate and make sure that we do a better job of matching migrants to the skills that we need. So there's a whole lot of visa classes that kind of don't seem to do a very good job of really making those matches. And I think we could do a much better job going forward to try and ensure that, we have the labour force that we need to generate the productivity that we want to generate.
I think most Australians, whether it be in industry or even just in out and about hospitality, would have experienced the labour shortages. How urgent is it that the federal government flicks the switch, at least as you said there, in the short term, in getting workers in here, both skilled, but as Matt Keane argues today, he's suggesting a new low-skilled visa as well?
Yeah, I would I agree really strongly with that. I think that this notion that we shouldn't allow low-skilled migrants into the country, I think is a huge mistake. We should allow migrants into the country who fill the needs that we have, regardless of where they are in our economy. So I'd say the inflation that we have at the moment is really significantly a figment of these labour shortages, right? So if we were able to get more of the kinds of workers we need to fill the kinds of positions that we have, that would lift the speed limit on the economy. So we have higher inflation than we need, and we have lower economic growth and lower prosperity than we need. So it sort of fulfills both of those requirements. And there aren't that many things that we can point to where that's the case. The thing I would point to on lower skilled migration is that we shouldn't see it as sort of exploitative or some kind of substitute for Australian low-paid workers. I think in many cases, low-skilled migrants come and that's a pathway to permanent citizenship for a lot of these people. The positions that are offered make a huge difference to their lives and livelihoods compared to where they come from, and they can give them a future in Australia and make Australians better off for having them here. So I think just in general, having a much more open-minded, optimistic view about the benefits to everyone of greater migration, and also the policies that we need to put in place alongside it, I think would be a huge improvement in terms of the discussion, but also in terms of the performance of our economy.
Last week's wages numbers were a bit soft. Where do you see wages, which will be another central issue at the Jobs and Skills Summit, where will they be heading over coming months?
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be an economic commentator because there's so many different things floating around at once, right? So we have this inflationary problem. The RBA and the Treasury expect inflation well above 7% on the way to 8% by the end of the year. And a lot of the things that we've been waiting for to see just how high inflation would get is whether this record low unemployment, this incredibly tight jobs market, will translate into wage pressures. And if they do that in a meaningful way, that could mean the inflation goes higher and longer than otherwise. And we see that in the US, right? US has inflation above 9% and they've had wage growth above 5%. Wages have exploded. Now, we haven't seen that in Australia yet, which on one hand, you might think, oh, high wages, that's good. But we have to be careful what we wish for, right? We really don't want a wage explosion at a time when we're trying to control inflation. So at least up to the end of June, wages are staying reasonably maintained. The concern, I guess, is that beyond June, a lot of wages are reset at the middle of the year. So the September quarter numbers that we get next in 3 months will really give us a better indication of just how high wages are set to rise and how difficult inflation will be to control. So, we should all be watching out for those signals. But again, with unemployment at 3.4%, it's hard to believe that wage pressures won't build in the near future.
And as of, I think it's next month or the month after, the RBA will have monthly CPI numbers, inflation numbers to work with. So they'll have a better sense of where all of that's at. Quite timely. What's your view on where the rates go?
Yeah, so it's well, I've often said, like, how can an advanced country like Australia, how is it that we have to wait 3 months to know what's happening to inflation, right? So this is a long overdue development. They have monthly inflation read in the US, and fantastic, great work by our Australian Bureau of Statistics. Penny pinching on economic information is about the dumbest thing you could ever imagine a government to do. So fantastic to see that. I think the inflationary situation is highly uncertain, right? If you survey market economists, you'll get a wide range of possible futures, and no economist has a crystal ball. But I would say, July 1 is a key time for both prices and wages. A lot of firms reset those things. We saw in the last inflation read a significant broadening in inflationary pressures. So it's no longer just sort of external factors. On the other hand, we've got energy prices coming down, and we've got a lot of these Asian supply constraints coming down, right? So if you have a huge reduction in energy prices, at least on headline inflation, that's going to offset any of that sort of underlying inflationary pressures. So, US last month had a 0% inflation read, right? So those big falls in energy prices fully offset any other inflationary pressures. So look, maybe it won't be as bad as some of our worst fears, but I think it'll take a little while for us to get a decent sense about just how embedded these inflationary pressures are.
Professor in Economics at George Washington University, Stephen Hamilton. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks as always.
Cheers, Kieran.